I already give it a like.
Hey, here we go. This is it. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 12 of Political Commentary, the Democrats' Identity Crisis. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to support me on Telegram, Subscribe Star, and Buy Me a Coffee. And you can follow the channel on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. I'm again joined by Florian. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so after Kamala Harris was defeated by Donald Trump, there has been a crisis of identity in the Democratic Party. So first of all, given that we've already covered Trump's immigration initiatives and the Democrat Party's response to the immigration initiatives, among other issues, they haven't been able to even maintain a coherent position on their own self. They don't have a single voice, right? So under the Obama administration, on a lot of issues, the Democrats spoke with one voice. They were all more or less in agreement on the basic issues. That's not the case now. Partly, you could say it's TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, and that's certainly part of it. But part of it, too, is there's been this crisis about wokeism, right? And how that contributed or did not contribute to Kamala Harris's defeat. I mean, there's two obvious takeaways from Trump's election and victory in 2025. One, nobody likes the woke. The people were just tired of the personal, political, broken friendships, broken relationships, just this unending rigmarole, and the immigration crisis. People were tired of immigrant crime. People were tired of all the negative effects of immigration. Now, we already talked about immigration, so we're not going to do that tonight. We're going to talk about woke. And so on the Democratic Party right now, there's basically two broad camps. There's what you might call the more moderate Triangulate camp, which is, like Bill Clinton in the 90s, just try to triangulate and go back to more moderate positions in order to win voters. The idea being that wokeism sort of isolates voters that are outside of the Democratic Party, and even within the Democratic Party that are not as hardcore for that, right? And then you got another group, which we could say, I guess, the quote unquote, they call themselves the economic progressives. More on that a little bit later. Whether they are or not is another thing. They're more, they're not so much saying we should ditch the woke, but we should rebrand in favor of more working class issues. Now, both sides are not ready to yet jettison the woke, though there are some voices within the Democratic Party that will say that. But for example, let's see, woke is dead. I remember recently, I think it was reading about, was it the woke is dead? That was a recent op-ed, but again, that's not something that they all get behind, right? But here, Maureen Dowd from the New York Times, woke is broke, and so yeah, there's that. Now that's actually probably the most accurate takeaway, but her voice is not the majority, though it is a sign of the times that this voice is even out there. It wouldn't have been there 5 years ago, right? So right now, the crisis is about what to do with the woke as a policy platform set. You've got basically keep it, but don't make it your main focus. That would be the, quote, economic progressives. You've got another group that says, well, let's tone it down and triangulate, and that's actually sort of led by Bill Clinton. And again, that's not jettisoning it. But then there's a smaller voice which says you should just jettison it. It's just not working. So that's where we are at right now. That's the basically sweep. Some other stuff is I did a video with Logos a few months ago about just this issue beyond just the Democratic Party. It also includes liberal commentators and so on and so on. We have the idea of kind of regulated neoliberal capitalism with like Ezra Klein. He thinks we could just return to that. But again, that doesn't really seem to address the issues that Trump was running against in 2024 rather. And so that's a voice out there, right? And then you've got, again, more progressive voices that are pivoting towards labor issues. But it must be said that in all of these cases, we don't have anybody who's quote unquote progressive like FDR was, right? If we're talking about economic policies, progressive. nobody's like FDR, not even close, right? It's just the needle's moving just a little bit, away from the woke because it was so toxic in the election with Trump, right? And so that's a survey, a brief summary of where things are. We'll dig in deeper as the show goes on. Florian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there are some aspects that we should also maybe redefine. For example, working class. I don't know whether there still is a working class. It seems like most of the working class is gone. There's no union representation for them anymore, or even if there is, people are not thinking in these terms anymore, right? I think had Clinton won the nomination in 2008 for the Democrat Party instead of Barack Obama, she would have strengthened those union roots a little bit more. But I think her husband made sure that the unionized Democrats are basically more or less done for in the long term, thanks to putting NAFTA in place. And what the Democrats represent economically is mostly service economy workers, healthcare workers, academia. Those are not traditional working class people. They don't go into the salt mines, or they don't work in the steel mills and stuff like that, right? So they're all desk workers and managerial types, and they are now the biggest base of the Democrats. And of course, in the office, you can think about woke all the time and favor that because it doesn't affect you really, right? It just may get annoying, and there was a backlash against it, but woke policies is kind of incompatible with the working class vote. But but the reason for that is that the Democrats have basically abandoned the working class, or if that even existed, basically made the working class, hampered the working class, if you will, and they are now very academically, theoretically minded, progressive. Yes, there's the woke element and everything, but it's not the hardened white guys. And that brings us to the next point. There's a significant fraction of ethnic votes in the Democratic Party. It seems like most of the politicians in Minnesota, in Somalian districts there, for example, they could basically even make Trumpism palatable to the people. They vote for their people. If they just like wave the Somali flag and then say whatever they want, they will be voted into office, which is not entirely true because it has its limits. Because in Minnesota, Mayor Fry, still that white progressive, still won against the what was his name, Omar Fateh. There was a Somali guy, and he was actually like holding a Somali flag and addressing the people in a town hall in his language. I should know which language that is. Shame on me for not knowing that, but it wasn't English, right? So and that was defeated. But on the other hand, you can make the case that Mamdani, who we'll talk about more next week, but you can already make the case that Mamdani was to a large part also voted into office by ethnic minorities, right? They did like polling, like surveys after the polls closed, and it turns out that those New Yorkers that have been born in New York, they voted much less for Mamdani than those who came into the city 5 years ago, right? So and those were majority, not let's say like this, they weren't Norwegians that came into New York in the last 5 to 10 years, right? So they vote there. He's their guy, right? Because he comes from a region that's similar to theirs, probably, and so he's from Uganda. So people identify with him because he's not white. That's also a large contingency of the Democrats, and I think it'll bite them in the neck at one point, because you know what remains from, like, if there's no, if they take the woke away and maybe the progressivism, then there is nothing left for the old white core of the Democrat Party. So I think that's also a problem for the Democrats. I think they give those people like a pass. They say, it's nice that we have immigrants and everything, and it goes against Trump. So you're very much in favor of immigrants, but those immigrants may have different goals at one point from the Democratic Party, and that is weakening the party on the long run, I think. And that may also contribute to a fractioning and internal civil war within the Democratic Party, or identity crisis. It's more like that right now.
Yeah. So you did bring up something interesting with the work, the landscape of people who do work. So obviously, say in the 1890s, most people who did work were what we would call working class. They were farmers, artisans, miners, whatever, right? Now we still have people that work in coal mines and lumber and fishing and manufacturing, but they don't, because of machines. Of course, we have fewer of them because machines do a larger proportion of the work. And while we still have what was once called the intelligentsia, university educated people, so obviously professors, but also like literati type people, and entertainers and whatnot. But the real information work is done in tech, which, it's like intelligentsia in that it's working with your mind and not your hands, but it's not cultural work, right? You're not creating cultural ideas. You're creating technology, code, all that stuff. Now there's overlap, of course, but it's not real, and that's really the more important base, right? But in a sense, though, people tend to forget because of the orders of abstraction that everything still has to come out of the ground. So let's go out to geopolitics. China has cornered the world market on lithium, and even though it's true, the U.S., and its allies like Taiwan manufacture all of these complex, computer systems and have an edge over China. China has gotten to the headwaters, so to speak, of this whole production chain process. And so it doesn't really matter how good your fab plants are. If you can't get the lithium, you can't make the computer chips. So it's like, well, you need the lithium. And so in this regard, you still need the guys to go underground to dig the coal out. You still need the guys to go and dig the iron out of the ground, right? All of that stuff is still really important. Now, it's not talked about much, right? And you still need, manufacturing. Of course, we've lost a lot already thanks to NAFTA, as you've pointed out. So, would those people be working class? Technically, no, right? But still, the pressures of competition from immigration would still affect, say, computer programmers. We saw this with H-1B visa brouhaha in the winter of 2024, right? December, with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. But the issue here is, and this is why the Democrats have an identity crisis, right? Is one, they've completely pivoted on what they historically were, right? This was a party that represented the American working class against corporate interests. Now they've completely flipped and now go out of their way to defend aliens against American citizens. That is a complete 180-degree flip from what they historically were, right? And so that right there is of necessity going to generate an identity crisis. Then you add to that all these disparate groups that don't really get along. How do feminists and Islamists get along? How do environmentalists, and techno bros get along, right? None of this stuff fits together. It makes no sense from a first principles perspective. Like, why would this be the case? Well, there's political reasons, right? But that doesn't mean it makes sense. It's expedient, right? And so that's going to create grounds for a crisis. And then you add to that the electoral defeat of Kamala Harris at the hands of Donald Trump and the lame duck presidency of Biden. It's like this is a movement that just is out of ideas and people, right? And now you have within the Democratic Party itself this ongoing debate, which, again, nobody with any real political power seems to be willing to ditch wokeism as such. It's more like, how much should we mute it, right? It was cranked up to like max volume under a Biden. And they're like, well, maybe we should just tone it down, right? They're not talking about getting rid of it. But this is still important to look at because it's a period of flux. They could at some point in the future determine that they want to get rid of it. We don't know if that's going to happen or not yet, but what we're seeing isn't inconsistent with such a future potential. And this identity crisis, as I said, I mean, you could have a set of purges that just put entirely new people within the Democratic Party. That's possible, right? But the ultimate reality is, if this doesn't get solved, we have to ask the question: will there even be a Democratic Party because one, they don't seem to be able to agree on anything. They have all these different groups that have ultimately opposed goals, right? They might think, well, we could work together to defeat Trump, and that's what they thought would hold it together. But of course, Trump won, so that didn't even work, right? So even that didn't work, right? Even the pragmatic, utilitarian, politically expedient argument, oh, we need to beat Trump, that didn't work because Trump won. And ultimately, what's odd, right, is again, this is supposed to be the party of the people, right? But Trump seems to have a much better finger on the pulse of what the people want, right? They're tired of woke. I mean, I think you can't look at this election, the last election, as not as a referendum against woke and as a referendum against current immigration policies, because that's what Trump pushed, and Trump won on that. I mean, that's just what he did, right? So the question then becomes, will the Democrats do that in time? I mean, obviously, the party could go back and look at FDR, look at Jackson, and see what made it great. But I don't know if they're going to do that. I don't know if they can do a mea culpa and say that all of these social, specifically woke issues and immigration issues they were wrong on, and then pivot and then go back to something like FDR. So, for example, they still want to channel the spirit of FDR with, like, say, the Green New Deal, which was floated by AOC, but it's nothing. It's just a policy proposal. There's nothing there. It's just rhetoric, right? People associate the New Deal with FDR and internal development programs, which this country actually really needs a lot of. Its infrastructure's got like a D rating by the Corps of U.S. Engineering Corps, whatever it is. It's not great, and so, but it's nothing there. It's just the appearance of something, right? And I think that's what the Democrats have been with the working class labor vote, right? They were able to coast on that for a while, right? And they thought that they just could keep doing that. And that's when Obama bragged about not having to campaign to those people. And then, of course, they voted for Trump in 2016. And they didn't learn the lesson. They doubled down. And then they lost again in 2025. So it's like, I just don't know if they have it in them to pivot. And if they can't pivot, I mean, what is going to be left in the long run?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said also for what will happen in the next year. Though 2025 is getting towards the end, and as someone pointed out on X today, um, basically for politic-wise, based on how Washington D.C. works, this is it, right? Because after the holidays, politicians in D.C., Congress, House Representatives, Senate, certain senators, all House Representative members will start doing their campaigns for election. There's no great policy proposal going to be pushed through, and maybe with a little bit of luck, but most congressmen and women will just choose to do policies or to embrace policies that will get them an immediate victory at the ballot box, right? So the person who pointed that out said it in light of the Trump administration. So basically, you could get frustrated because, in a way, the neocons have wasted the Trump peak year, right? But the same can be said for the Democrats, right? They will also not get much. Like they will talk a lot, but they won't get much done, or they won't have viable policy proposals in next year because everyone is just campaigning, right? So for the Democrats, it's even worse because they created, in a way, right? They created this whole grand narrative that they are the good party, the moral party. They will help the unfortunate and so on, and will help the environment. But the Green New Deal is a good point. First of all, it's like FDR, but I mean, who knows about FDR anymore, right? He was an idol for many Americans, but it's almost 100 years ago now. So FDR, I don't know how much pull FDR still has. And Green New Deal, they don't work on it, as you said. And I think they don't work on it because there's a lot of narrative and branding that they receive, especially since Europe seems to be really bent on implementing a sort of like Green New Deal policy framework. and then and maybe that's even pushed by USAID and other organizations, right? But it's like it seems like we are all. I mean, if you're a Democrat, it may seem to you that we are all working on bettering the environment, and not much is really happening, right? And especially with social media, there's a lot of branding. But I give you one example that we have all heard. The ones So first of all, as you said, the Democrats have a reactive narrative. We want to prevent Trump. That's not good. You don't want to define your policy by the other party. You know, even if it's we want to prevent Trump, but yeah, that doesn't cut it anymore. Not like 2020. And if you say, and then the biggest element they seem to have, like all these Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Democrats. That's what they call themselves now. Occupy Democrats means from some PR agency probably designed. All they talk about is how Trump is a fascist and Trump is like Hitler. Still, that's a lazy narrative. If you're on the left, you would think yourself, what are you guys doing? And these people really think they fight fascism in electing Mamdani or other people, and Trump is a fascist. That's what these guys think. These guys thinking that's a very lazy narrative. It's retarded, and it doesn't move the needle at all. I mean, it hinders the Democratic Party from getting something new created, because if you just point fingers at one guy and basically you could see calling someone fascist maybe a call for violence against the person, but that may have worked in 2020 when they have all the BLM riots out there, but it's not. It's basically an old narrative that is reactive and rehashed and won't help the Democrats one bit going forward. And I think what also is a problem is that almost everyone who has a Twitter account or X account who has more than 100,000 followers, many people of them are letting themselves get monetized by some influencer shop. Okay, so that means they're just interested in some branding, making some money, but they're not interested in bringing a winning message out there, or striking up a policy package that they could implement on day one, and everything gets better economically wise and so on. So we may think that the Democrats are like riding a blue wave now, based on the results from Virginia and New York and New Jersey. But it's a little bit like they are a lot into branding, but not into viable policy proposals or viable strategy of going forward. That's what it seems to me, right? At one point, it's good if you can mobilize people through social media, but if everyone just clicks like and thinks he has done a revolutionary action, you're not getting much done in total, and it's not going to be a big movement.
Yes. So let's back up a little bit to sort of explain this messaging crisis. What part of it is right now, right? We're seeing this, that they don't have a unified voice on issues. They can't, whereas the Trump administration does. They take their marching orders from Trump, and then down the line, everybody just says what they're supposed to. Part of the problem is the Democratic coalition makes this inevitable. So if prior to the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, there was an article, I believe, in the New York Times. I want to say it was called The Death of Feminism, but something to that effect. And it was written before the ruling, but everybody kind of knew which way the ruling was going to go. It was kind of inevitable. And this Jewish woman said that what ended up happening was that two things brought down feminism. One was the infighting within the feminist movement. That's more to the Democrats. And then, saying how people online created a negative framing of feminism. So right-wing people, she didn't mention him, but I think Sargon Avocado is probably implied because he was one of the first anti-feminists on YouTube to start. Also, there was Thunderfoot, the New Atheist. He was also one of the early anti-feminists. And that whole movement really took, feminism down a few notches. But the big struggle was TERFs versus trans. That was entirely generated by the Democratic Party. And of course, as long as they had a unified woman vote that they could count on, that gave them a lot of power. But they ended up creating elements within their own party that fractured that block. And now, you know, the TERFs are called fascists, reactionaries, and they kind of don't know where to go. Some are leaning more Republican just out of necessity, but you know, they're kind of in limbo at the moment, and that just completely fractured their block of women voters in the way that Senator Bill Clinton or even Obama, that wasn't a problem, right? And so their own ID poll is creating the identity crisis. They have these voting blocks that hold together, and then they torpedo it because, you know, then you had the whole trans athletes thing, and then trans and women's bathroom thing, and yeah, it turns out that even liberal women don't like that. And so again, that was brought to the forefront and just, you know, under the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and just shoved down everyone's throats, really just undercut their own base. That's just bad politics. If you have a solid base of support like that, you don't undermine it. You don't blow it up. You don't create more infighting. You harness that, right? And they just didn't do that. And partly because they can't, because the Democratic Party has become the party of aliens. It doesn't support Americans anymore like it used to, right? Let's go back to FDR, right? That Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson, supported the average working class American. It was populist, it was working class, and it had strong immigration policies. They did not support aliens. So we have a political party that just completely supports aliens. I mean, treason's a strong word, but like, what do you call a party whose voting block is not the people of the country that it's supposed to govern in the interests of? You know, that's why the Democrats have this crisis. And of course, woke policies have nothing to do with they have everything to do with economics, actually, as I've said elsewhere. These are just masks in order to shield to confuse actual economic forces with social forces, right? I did a video on the trans movement as a product of capitalism. It couldn't exist in socialist countries. It didn't exist in socialist countries historically. And so it creates this loyalist bloc for the capitalist class, which, you know, undercuts working rights because they have every interest in keeping this thing going, which with the old Democratic Party at least was interested in regulating and controlling rather than just letting it have free reign. And so, but because they have this civil rights narrative and the transgender movement tapped into that, they didn't have anything within their own party to say, no, we're not going to do this. And that blew up their female voting base. And so furthermore, I think because of that, it'll be very hard for the Democrats to reform an identity. And if it were to be necessary, purge and replace members, because it would just go against the entire narrative of civil rights that they've been pushing since the 50s. So yeah, it's they're not doing good, Florian.
Yeah, so maybe what I mentioned in the beginning is more important on the long run for the Democrats than you would think. I remember seeing that most Indian immigrants, for example, they support the Democratic Party. But judging on what people have reported from Indian going into corporations, like you have a HR manager who is Indian. As soon as he gets a senior position, he will make sure that that majority of people hired for the company are Indians, right? Indians can be extremely ethnic centered, right? They will promote their own people, and I'm wondering even whether that might be a problem for the Democratic Party, because then you have like Indian immigrants, they become Democrats, and then they'll also take the party apparatus and basically replace them more and more with their own people. Which is one way to get into politics, right? I remember my old chemistry teacher telling us, if you want to go to politics, you take 4 or 5 friends who think like you, and you go into the political party of your choice, different counties, and then you already have people, you already have someone, you're basically already a group, and you have each other's back, and then that way you rise. So I think political parties are pretty ripe for being taken over by certain groups with a very specific identity. And so that may also be a problem long term for the Democratic Party. I don't even know right now what happens to these. What happens to the Somali community in Minnesota, for example? Ilan Omar and other people. They are. They have any white Americans there in their party, or it's like mostly Somalis, or not? That would be interesting to look at. But I suspect that will, on long term, be a problem for the old Democratic base, at least, because you'll have more non-Native American groups that will then if you have several of them in one party, then the party may also fracture into tribalism, right? I can also see that problem. It may be worth to look a little bit more deeply into that.
Right. So we have a question in the chat from John Morris. My question is whether it's possible to steer the Democratic Party towards a more right-wing perspective, specifically in the direction of a blue labor strategy. I wouldn't say it's impossible. And the way you'd want to do this is all of the culture stuff, which is just the thing is what a thing does. So all these cultural issues are just union busting tactics. If you had, more conservative minded white men or just white people in general getting involved in the Democratic Party, what you do is you just always hit working class issues. And then every time a cultural issue is brought up, you point to it as a union busting strategy. And we can do that very easily with the Whole Foods heat map, as was given to us by Verge, which says that diversity lowers unionization rates. There you go. So, that's it. You just keep hammering that. And then, if people start complaining about, nonsense like sensitivity or empathy, you just tell them, look, would you rather have better working conditions? Would you rather have better wages and pensions, or, whatever this is? Right? I mean, nobody's going to argue with that once you start bringing it in, right? That's the thing. Once you start delivering those real world benefits with real world policies, then the naysayers shut up, okay? Because you got a better working conditions, you got better pensions, you got better salaries, and you got more time off, right? I mean, no one's going to argue with that once it happens, and you just stay on point. Anything that deviates from that, you just frame as union busting strategies, okay? Because that's what they are. They're union busting strategies, and they've said this, right? And so once you do that, and then the other thing you do, the old follow the money line, all of these, woke or pro-immigrant members of the Democratic Party, you just follow the money and start, showcasing that they're getting, money from these large corporate donors in order to look the other way as they bring in these undocumented workers, breaking the laws of the country. The other thing you do is you just keep on pointing to sweatshops, right? 20 years ago, sweatshops are bad. Now, OMG, I love sweatshops. ICE are Nazis. I mean, this is just stupid. No, like you need to point to these people and say you are defending sweatshops and the exploitation of these people. And you just stick on that point. And I guarantee you would have success if you could do that. The question is, does anybody have the will to do that? I don't know. Only time will tell. Florian?
Yeah, I remember it was a term during the Obama presidency. They were called blue dog Democrats. They were people from like working class white counties and or districts, and someone like Kirsten Gillibrand in New York, Senate. I think is she senator? I should know that, but she was a senator in New York at least during the time, and she was tapping into her blue dog coalition roots. That was some headlines they had in the newspaper. And these people have faded away a little bit, and I think they were basically not they were basically not able to withstand the narrative shift in the Democratic Party. So in the past, these blue dog Democrats, this conservative Democratic Party perspective, has not fared that well. But if you do it, as Todd say, maybe you can do it now. Maybe the time would be now for doing that, because there's no overarching narrative anymore, and people are just hanging at each other's throat, and so maybe then there's a way for a unifying person to say, look, there's a lot of bullshit going on, but if we go back to our roots, it's going to benefit all Americans, something like that, right? So I think from that point of view, it can work. but the caveat is it hasn't worked in the past. And yeah, I'm optimistic on that. I think a good question, but
yeah. So I think also riffing off this question, we can then flip it on the other side with the Republicans. Now, once upon a time, you did have, progressive era Republicans like, say, Teddy Roosevelt, that would have been known for, quote, progressive economic policies, right? And that's not been the case for quite some time. But as we've said in our previous episodes on immigration, even though Trump frames his immigration policy and ICE policy on issues of national security, it obviously has economic consequences. Now, a lot of the Democrats, there we go, we love this, right? It hurts businesses. I mean, really, the fact that the Democrats are complaining that policies hurt businesses is beyond laughable. This is beyond laughable. This is the Democrats 20 years ago never would have talked like this. It just shows you how much they've become corporate shills. Like, okay, yeah, but the entire MO is to hurt businesses because you want to rein them in because they're exploiting sweatshop labor, right? In the American Southwest I know people forget Cesar Chavez was a Mexican labor organizer in the United States, a Mexican American who was a Democrat who called the immigrants wetbacks. He's on record saying that. How did we go from Cesar Chavez to this? It's a complete flip on everything that they ever stood for. And that needs to be pointed out. And so I think that this means that the Republican Party actually has more of a chance at becoming a pro-labor party. No, it hasn't done so yet. If we want to couch this in terms of developing a class consciousness, the Republican Party doesn't have it yet, but the Democratic Party just frankly doesn't have it at all. Or if it does, it's in defense of the bourgeoisie. It's in defense of the capitalist class. The Republicans at least have a space in which you can talk about immigration policy, such as curtailing immigration and deporting immigrants back, so that you can, shore up the labor market for working class Americans. So if you do want to have now there are going to be small business interests that will get in your way in the Republican Party. If you want to unionize and start doing, labor organizing. So that's a problem. But, is it any worse than if you try to do it in the Democratic Party? Probably not. And it's probably going to be easier because they don't have the woke, right? You don't have to deal with all of these social issues, which are just union-busting issues as such. That needs to just be, every time they come up, someone needs to call it union-busting because that's what it is. It has nothing to do with actually helping working class people, right? And so, and in fact, they're defending sweatshops in the American Southwest, in the agribusiness industry. So it's like, whatever. And then they're going to be like, no, we want to lift up the undocumented workers and let them come in. Well, that's just absurd. You can't do both. That's not possible. These are two policies that cancel each other out. And this also illustrates why the United States isn't a real country. We just live in this like cartoon land of cartoon politics where these aren't real issues. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm a trans woman. I want to use a woman's bathroom. Like, how many people actually wake up in the morning and say that? Right? 0.1%, right? This is not an issue. The real issue is the rising cost of food, which, the declining value of labor and so on. Florian.
yeah, what I also found interesting was the narrative that emerged from the left, which I found very tone deaf. Basically, when I started rounding people up and starting to deport people, the Democrats would circulate memes where they claimed, "Oh, Americans they don't want to plug strawberries," and "Oh, the immigrants do the job that Americans don't want to do." This is, for example, first of all, this is an old trope that has been always said. We need to bring in guest workers because we need to bring in guest workers in the 1970s because the German apparently we didn't want to make their fingers dirty, which is complete bullshit. But that was the narrative back then. Um, also, basically similar narrative, right? Oh, ICE deports people, and who will pluck the strawberries anymore and stuff like that. very, very insulting if you think about it. And so that makes it easy for the GOP to claim that working people mantle, right? Yeah, sure. There are some policies like minimal wage that I believe do hurt small businesses, and but it also hurts small businesses uh, because the landscape is such that we have so many corporations here that small businesses struggle already, right? And so large businesses have the power to just, Amazon could say, we want the minimum wage at $25 per hour, and for Amazon, that's an investment into killing off the competition, right? They make a little bit minus for 2, 3 years, and then they forget their pledge of minimum wage and bring the wages down again. So corporations have a lot of power in the country, and it's only because some like libertarians would say that corporations do that because they have given the power by the state to form monopolies. You can discuss if that's really true or not, but the fact is, there are some policies that would maybe hurt small businesses. But still, the Republicans could claim back the mantle. I'm sure you can find some kind of compromise where people get to work again, right? Because whether companies replace the junior level positions by artificial intelligence or all Indians, could both mean AI, then you still have Americans that are cut out from the workforce when they want to start working, right? And that's not a good situation to be in. So if the Republicans are smart, they adopt that mantle, and I kind of see the chances 50-50. The Democrats may be lucky when the neocon fraction in the Republican Party continues to wield that much inordinate power. If they would just give up, if we didn't have the neocons, the Republican Party would already be the what do you call it? The Republican Party would already be the
Labor Party.
the Labor
Yeah.
Party, exactly, right? So, but there's still a chance for the Republicans, and long term, it may actually happen, right? That the Republicans will be more in favor of labor, hard labor, right? Not so much service sector labor. I think that kind of labor is gone. Like the academia will never go back to being Republican if they ever were, right? And healthcare workers as well. But you maybe don't need to reach all these people, right? You can make sure that you have blue collar jobs, more of them. And if AI is there, retrain people in some way, shape, or form. I don't believe in all doomsday. We have all this AI will replace everything, but it can't be that young people who are just out of college can't get a job because there's simply not many, or simply the supply of labor is so low. Also, when the Republicans are successful in deporting more immigrants, um, even only just the illegal immigrants, then you already get better labor. That you can already pay people better for their labor. So that's something that the Democrat Party just doesn't touch, and that could be to their peril if the Republicans pick that up.
Yeah, yeah, and this is again why I think if there is going to be a return to labor, a pro-labor policy, it will come out of the Republicans rather than the Democrats, because the Democrats just can't. The idea of having a nation with borders that you defend is just anathema to the Democrats. I don't know what happened. I mean, I do, but like FDR again had very strict immigration policies, and they were pretty strict through Democrat, presidents right up until 1965. That's when it all changed. Thank you, Johnson. Right, that's what happened. So that's when it all changed, and but back to the identity crisis. The reason why the Democrats are having this identity crisis, and why I it would be too rash to say they could never fix it. But the longer you wait, the harder it gets to fix, and eventually there will be a point at which you just go off a cliff. The United States has had two parties that disappeared in the past. One was the Federalist Party, and then the Whigs. So the Federalist Party collapsed during the War of 1812, and much of its base in New England did not support the war. And I think the Whig Party split over issues of slavery in the 1840s. So it is possible the Democratic Party to go the way of the Federalists and the Whigs. Just because it's older than the Republican Party doesn't mean that it's predestined to survive. But one of the main difficulties it has is this civil rights narrative, because what has happened is well, okay, old school term here, workers that aren't unionized or work while you're on strike or reduce the likelihood of a strike are called scabs. What identity politics is, and this is why the left can't win, and what the civil rights narrative is, and why the Democrats can't fix this, is it's just saying scabs are victims. It's just saying that all of these things, it just keeps on redefining what a scab is. So you have 1,001 different flavors and colors of scabs, and it's like, okay, these people are all protected now by the government. Well, that just makes unionizing impossible, because they're protected by the government, and then the corporations are required to hire them as parts of diversity quotas. And it's like, wow, I wonder who came up with that. I wonder who was behind all of this, or who does this benefit? We obviously know who it benefits, right? And this is where the Democratic Party, it used to go from, okay, labor, it used to be labor, and then it became civil rights. So the 50s and the 60s was the turning point for the Democratic Party, where it became a party of civil rights rather than a party of labor. And at that moment, it became a party of scabs, because all of these groups that they were propping up and propagating and supporting cumulatively had the effect of undercutting organized labor. And they just become the party of scabs. And you just have to say that. They're the party of scabs.
Yeah, and I think the Democratic Party. I think as soon as World War II was over, the American industry or American politicians lobbied for laws that made immigration easier. Of course, on one point, people felt a moral obligation to take on displaced people through the big war that they just had finished. But on the other hand, it's also probably the industry in the U.S. Wanted to use the opportunity to grow, because they had the entire market for themselves, right? The U.S. kind of went out and destroyed one half of the world's economy, which was mostly from Europe back then, and Russia did the rest. So basically, half the world's economy was for the U.S. to be taken. And so maybe then industry really wanted to grow and wanted to have more people working, and so they may have sponsored some of those bills. Hart-Celler Act came out 1965, yeah, and I also think it was kind of like an anti-white effort, right? So basically, white people in Europe were seen as the Nazis, and it was. I mean, most of the Nazis were white. It's just a fact, right? So then they wanted to push back against that, maybe, and in a way, the Civil Rights Act, there was also a lot of animus behind it to push back against the whites, which were seen as exploiters and racists. And so for the Democrats at that point, probably everything was good enough to just bring more people in to drown out the white population and to dilute it. And you know, in that spirit, then pro-immigration stances became more prominent in the Democrat Party, and also then probably industry saw there's an opening, and hey, we can get cheaper labor. The more people we have, the less cost of labor is, and it wasn't seen as big of a problem in the 60s, because thanks to the economic domination of the U.S., the situation was that now even people from the traditional working class could afford a middle class house. They could live like richer people, right? So everybody thought, oh yeah, we're swimming in gold, or swimming in money, and we can get more people in for all the work that we're going to have. And by the way, it's also good that maybe we have more non-white people here, because white people haven't always been the best in the past. So let's have more immigration. That was probably what went through Democrats' head, and then gradually the Democrats became the party of immigrants, and with more industry and capital behind those efforts, slowly but certainly the unionization part was just drowned out of the Democrat Party.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have another question from the chat, and we'll end the show with this. John Morrison asks, my other question is that white people have altruism framework whereby they must completely sacrifice their own needs and well-being for others without expecting anything in return. A lot of this, I think, is just conditioning, right? It's actually civil rights propaganda conditioning. Because if you look at, say, I mean, again, let's go back to, even the idea that you just sit down and then just, take it for the greater good. That's not the labor movement, right? The labor movement in the United States. I mean, just listen to any song from Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. The idea is I'm not going to let some guy take advantage of me, not the boss, not some corrupt political machine. We're gonna stand up for our rights. And of course, who was the audience for these songs back in the 30s? Well, white people, because they were the majority population who were listening to these songs, right? And this idea that we just kind of like look the other way and lie down and take it. Again, I think that's partly that's due to the surplus wealth that you talked about, Florian, right? People just get soft with the wealth and then they feel guilty because they have it and other people don't. And they forget why they have it in the first place, the hard work of these, labor activists, right? And there's that. Then there's the concerted propaganda effort from the media, from the academy, and from the government that demoralizes you, right? So Yuri Bezmenov talks about the process of demoralization, where he was speaking about it from the point of view of communist propaganda, but it also is coming from our own government, where it demoralizes us so that we don't, we don't hold our heads up high and look at ourselves in the mirror and like what we see. And why would you do that? Well, a country that's homogeneous and united and believes in itself isn't going to allow itself to get invaded by scabs. That's why they're doing this. That's why they're doing this, because as long as America was like that, you couldn't open the floodgates to the whole world and then just sink the labor market. So, you not only have to change the law, which is what the Hart-Celler Act was, they changed the law. You also have to demoralize the population in order to accept the consequences of this new law. And I would argue that that's been conditioned rather than an ingrained part of, and it wasn't that long ago that we would have stood up for our rights and said, no, we're not going to let the borders be thrown wide open. No, we're not going to let a political machine or some boss, just lead us around by the nose. Think of like the Golden Age Hollywood films, where, some guys like, you're not going to make a monkey out of me, right? That was just ingrained a part of the American spirit, not that, about 100 years ago, like you said, right? So it's not that long ago that Americans thought like this. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just reminded of that Leonard Cohen song. I don't know what the title of the song is, but the song text goes, there's one line, it goes, first we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin. And later on, he described that song as basically a terrorist song. And he means that in terms of like a, revolutionary change in the human spirit. Yet all these singer-songwriters or all these artists and culture creators that were basically also harping on that, basically saying that we need to be more gentle with the world and we need to open our arms to the world and so on. And those narratives actually favored the capital class. Who would have thought, right? But they also played a role. Which say what you said before with songs about no monkeys. What was it again?
You're not going to make a monkey out of me.
Yeah, you're not going to make a monkey out of me. That's different from saying first we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin, right? It was a backlash against perceived Nazi ideology that was still around or whatever in Europe, and it was. But even the anti-fascist groups in the 70s and 80s, they were working against international capital, and I would say they kind of fulfilled. They were kind of the useless idiots for them, right? But they were not arguing for the working class population of one country. They were arguing for the international capitalist class is an evil system and should be destroyed. But what with that they basically destroyed the destroyed the income base of the blue collar population of their own countries. But they thought they're being revolutionary in spirit, and so they want to have everyone come into the country, and we're all sharing global solidarity, and it actually destroys their own base in their own country. But they didn't see that because everything was framed in a moral paradigm. Like, we need to change our politics because it's the moral thing to do, and that was also fatal. But that has helped the Democrats decline as we see now, and that has basically helped importing scabs, as you said.
All right. Well, that's the end of tonight's show. Thanks again, Florian. Always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the President Fly Podcast signing off.